Hello, everyone. This is Join the Light Side podcast. I am your host, Michael. Today, we're going to be discussing a little bit of a different topic. It will somewhat pertain to mental health, and I suppose you could say a current event sort of angle from it as well. But largely, we're just going to dive into it. So the subject matter that I would like to be discussing today in particular is the idea of sex in the modern world. So for starters, I'm going to include a little bit of preamble so you understand a little bit of where I'm coming from, and that way you can be informed with sort of where my perspective comes from, and you can see how it's influenced the decisions I've made. So if you didn't go and watch the first couple episodes that I released, I was including in there some of the sort of political views that I tend to think within. Those particular views are within the camps of conservatism and classical libertarianism. So within that respect, I guess if one were to approach this from a parameter standard, I guess you could say in my early 20s, I was very much, very left on the viewpoint from, I guess you could say, like from a sex relationship standard. In my early 20s, I had gotten into a relationship, whereas I was sort of sold the message that, like, as long as you had open communication, that you were with a consenting party, that there was no reason why you couldn't have your cake and eat it too, I guess you could say. Now, I think a lot of the issues within this sort of subject is that a lot of them, they seem to be all right from the ideals realm, where you can think these things all you want, but I think that when it comes to affecting interpersonal relationships, you can try to rationalize things as much as you want, but at the end of the day, there is some very deep-seated human emotion that is largely difficult to dismiss, and I think jealousy is one of those things. So during that time, I had some, I guess you could say, interesting exposure in my early 20s. I'm not going to be mentioning anybody's specific names, obviously. That would be completely inappropriate, but the person that I was seeing at the time, I met her while I was working, which was, in hindsight, dating somebody that you work with is, I'm sure it's worked out for many people, but I'm sure that many of you can relate to it not necessarily working out in the long run, unless maybe you've gone and relocated with work. So, with building on that sentiment, I started to see her, like I said, in my early 20s. I was also, we started casual at first, and I began to like her for who she was, and I think also looking back on it, there was sort of an idea about her as well that drew me in as well, the element of, adventure and experimentation, as that is frequently something that is very attractive to the younger audience. So I guess you could say, well, after a few months of dating her, she brought to my awareness a particular, I guess you could say it's a social media platform for fetish-related material. So I joined this website and I started to become exposed to this sort of material, and it is certainly an echo chamber of sorts. Lots of avid advocates for this sort of lifestyle, which, like, within these individuals' own right, I did meet a decent amount of good people. I think that, like, the issue wasn't necessarily with the peoples themselves. It was more of the sorts of ideas that they were inhabiting. So after about a year of us dating, there was some things that came up where she wanted to sort of return back to that sort of lifestyle. She wanted to enter a open relationship, and given that I was like in my early 20s, I was up to that point, I had only been in monogamous relationships, and I'd already grown emotionally attached to this person. I was thinking that what's the worst that can happen, which I would find that out later. But at the time, I was thinking that this could be a good thing. It would be a interesting experience, and why not give it a shot? So we would attend over the next year or so a few, no way to put it lightly, we attended some like sexually related parties. These were private invite. There was a fair few individuals that were there. I think that the largest of the venues was about maybe around 100 people. Like there's a fair number of them. They were very well organized. There was areas that were meant for socializing, and then others for other particular activities. They were to be held in specific areas of where it was being hosted, which in these in particular, they were like in a rented mansion or something like that. And so I've seen lots of things. I've sort of not even dipped into that sort of lifestyle. I've been a part of it. I didn't engage in anything particularly extreme myself, but I definitely did witness some pretty interesting things. But anyway, so just so you have a bit of more insight into what I've been exposed to in that regard. So I've sort of been on that sort of ideological side of the aisle, you could say. I was very taken by the message, and like I said from the beginning, I was convinced that, you know, if there was enough communication within the partnership, there was no reason why we couldn't just have all these sort of hedonic pleasures amongst one another and be able to like still have a semblance of a relationship and whatnot. And that definitely did not really play out particularly well later on, finding out that the person that I was with at the time, she was, I think this is actually something that's like a pretty universally held theme for a lot of people that live this sort of lifestyle. I think that intimately speaking, they are hindered in some respect, and I think that is sort of a compensation sort of method for connecting with other people that may be in sort of the same situation as them. And since we are very much social beings, I suppose that you could say that was their mode of engaging in sociability. From what I was observing, which that was one of the things that I did like about that experience, actually, was learning about people and their sort of motivations. I did learn a lot in that sort of respect. So with that aside, I will probably mention a few other little things here and there with some personal anecdotes and sort of the stake that I have in the matter. But now on to the next things. So I'm very much convinced that given what I've been through and which I am currently in, which is a very stable and emotionally invested relationship without any sort of complications of that kind of nature, in which, thank goodness, I certainly don't want anything remotely resembling that. It's, in my opinion, it is inherently destabilizing, having a mix of partners and stuff like that. I don't think is a good long-term solution. So I do not advocate for that. However, we do live in a sort of free society that way, but I will follow it up with saying proceed at your own peril. Because in my opinion, I don't think it's going to play out particularly well for you, but I still wish for all of you the best. So anyway, with what I was saying before, I think this whole notion of sex being something that can just be a disposable pleasure, I think is actually a grave mistake. This whole idea that we can be emotionally entangled with other individuals without any sort of other hang-ups, I think it goes against our nature largely. And if somehow you are able to engage in that sort of behavior, I think that there is things within your life that need addressing, and that there is reason for your comeuppance into a short-term mating strategy sort of solution. And I just don't think that it's in most people's best interest. I think that there is way too many sort of insecurities that could be bred from that, whether if it be, you don't know, it's such an intimate act, engaging in sex with somebody, and there's so much preamble that needs to be known before you engage in something like that, or you could be engaging with somebody potentially dangerous, and if you don't have adequate just background information about them, it can work against you very quickly. So the whole idea of casual sex from that sort of perspective, I just don't think is a good idea. Also, just inherently in the fact that if you're, say, a woman, I think that just especially from an evolutionary psychology angle, there is much more costs attached in engaging in sexual acts, especially with males. If you don't swing that way, that's all well and good. But in particular, it is sort of rooted in psychological research that's been documented that if you were to pick out a subset of males that are capable of, I guess you could say, uncommon aggression, more often than not, you're going to be picking out a male from the crowd than a female. And especially if it comes to physical aggression, that is even more likely to be a man. So there's that also to consider. And also, if you're engaging in short-term mating strategies, there's also the risk of pathogens and viruses, and maybe the person that you're with doesn't even know that they're afflicted by that. And I think that the messaging that's been coming out as of late from the radical left in trying to justify having like multiple partners and whatnot, and they're playing down STDs and STIs, I think is extremely concerning, and it is completely neglecting the reality of how terrible those sorts of illnesses can be and how much they can affect your life. And a lot of them, they're treatable, but they're not like curable. Like, you're gonna have that for like the rest of your life, and you're gonna have to take those medications and be dependent on like an external measure such as medication. And I don't think that's exactly a desirable outcome. So there's that to consider. So all in all, just from that subject in general, I'm sure much more that I can say, but there's other things I want to discuss, so I'm not going to go into that in any more length. I think that there is sort of a pathological messaging too when it comes to the message of empowerment behind sexual expression, and sort of how that may come out in the engagement of short-term mating strategies. So like, I think that it can play out much differently when you develop a stable partnership, and you can sort of have that exchange, and you can take comfort in knowing that who you're with would never harm you, if that's the sort of thing that you like engaging in, and it's something that you can have some reciprocity over. That's another story. But when you're like just meeting this person for the first or like second time, you don't really know that much about them, it certainly leaves you like vulnerable to potential like power dynamics that like until you start engaging in it, like you're not really aware of what you may be entering, and it could potentially turn violent or compromising, like something that you may later greatly regret. So there's always that. And I think that there is neurological pathways too, that like if you engage in particular types of behavior that sort of like exerts that sort of power over somebody, I think that it's like damaging not only to the receiving party, but also for the person that is engaging in that sort of behavior, especially since it is so short-term minded. Later in your life, because like just going off of the original statement that we are like very socially oriented beings, if you're not engaging in genuinely reciprocal behavior, like especially of that nature, I just don't think it's going to favor you in the long run. So there's that to consider. I think that one of the greatest things to be wary of, though, is the whole temporary nature behind the hedonistic enterprise. Like, it is so fleeting and temporary that, like, while you're in your early 20s, I'm sure that there is I guess you could say, well, it's like a rewarding aspect because it's like physically pleasuring and you may like it at the time, but there's also the grim reality too. I know that it is very much a feminist oriented lens that says that, you know, like a woman that's had many sexual partners is a slut, and a man who's had many partners is a stud. Now, I don't quite hold that opinion. I think that a guy that goes through a lot of women too devalues himself as well. I very much am an egalitarian, I guess you could say, in that sense. I think that having an excessive amount of partners in that respect, it sort of gives at least the impression that your standards are quite low. And I think that there is definitely an evolutionary basis to the statement that if you demonstrate the ability to discriminate who you want as a sexual partner, I think that greatly increases like your relational value. So there's always that to consider as well. And there's been material lately that I've been looking at where there will be it's mostly females, grant you, but they'll be looking at engaging like in a OnlyFans sort of career while they're young, and they've drawn attention to the fact that it can be a trap. Like it can put you in a very much a position where you won't be able to get any other line of work. And like if you're like 27 years old, you've been doing OnlyFans for the past like 5 years, and you don't have anything else to put on your resume like apart from that. And there's the very like it is a reality. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but the reality that when you go and engage in a line of work such as sex work, it's generally not looked upon very kindly, and generally people will just not want to be associated with that in a general occupational sense. So you're definitely limiting your options when you engage in that sort of behavior, and I just don't think it's going to pan out for you in the long run, whether if that's something that is like good or moral for society to be doing. To be honest, from my perspective, I don't think that like someone should be demeaning or demoralizing themselves in such a manner to be making ends meet. I think that people have much more to them, intellectually speaking, than just to be putting their bodies out there in such a sexualized manner. And that's perceivably like what you're worth. I mean, that's what you're presenting to the world, and I'm sure there's much more to you, and I'm not saying that that's all somebody's worth if they engage in such a career path, but that's certainly the impression that's brought across. So yeah, to your potential viewers, that's certainly how they'll view you. And there's also the whole notion too that like when you go and put that kind of content out there, it's on there forever, and it's brutal. Like I've heard of these sorts of deep fake videos that have been coming out where people's images have been plastered over other scenes all over like Pornhub and stuff, and that's just from people just being on Twitch too. So there's always that, which is another terrible thing, maybe for another podcast. But when your content is out there like that, people are very likely, especially if you're young and attractive, they're very likely to be recording you, and maybe they'll actually be saying they are you and selling like your material off to third-party sources. And from there, there's really nothing that you can do about it. That content's already out there, and a lot of these things that I'm saying, I'm not saying as a matter of whether if it's right or wrong. It's just, it's a reality. It's happening, and it's just something to definitely consider if, like, before you ever engage in any of this. Because, unfortunately, it doesn't really seem like there's any going back from it. There's definitely the aspect, too, to be considering from the hedonic stem or the hedonic angle, where it's like when you engage in these sorts of behaviors, you also are learning a form of attentional as I would say, misuse. I mean, you're like using your reward pathway in your neural circuitry to indicate that when you engage in these sorts of behaviors, there is like a reward that like you want to constantly pursue, and it becomes more pervasive as time goes on. And I can definitely speak to this sort of the subject too, especially with being that in my early 20s, especially when I was in that relationship that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. I was pretty emotionally unfulfilled within the relationship, and being as I wasn't very emotionally developed at the time, and of course I have the sort of hindsight bias that if I knew now, maybe I wouldn't engage in that behavior, but thankfully I did not have to pay any terrible price for going about any of that. So I remain not really regretful. I don't find that particularly useful, but nonetheless, I think that like when you engage in these sorts of behaviors of like trying to engage in things like casual sex, or even just like viewing sexual matters as casually as like looking at pornography, I think that is like inherently damaging to yourself, to basically attribute that there is no sort of like nuance to like socializing with others and engaging in like meaningful romantic like relationships. That certainly isn't going to play out well for you in the long run. And I'm not necessarily saying that like you need to like, you know, engage in the traditional lifestyle where you get a house together and you have kids, and which I definitely do advocate for. I think that's a really good vision for the future. But I think that being able to construct a meaningful vision with another partner, I think is something that is very much like, if not like the most meaningful thing, it is like definitely very much up there. And there's a reason why we've had that sort of pursuit for like much of the course of like our like modern development, and it is a very good way to try and navigate through the sorts of tumultuous times that we're in. So there's that to consider. I think that there is very much something that has been spoken to by a lot of public figures lately, especially that of Jordan Peterson, where we haven't really like at least had a public discussion about the sort of effect that like the birth control pill has. Like the fact that we've basically disparaged with like our entire like course of history what it means to like have a reproductive system, that you can just take this pill and you don't have to worry about that anymore. It's not just like dispensing with that sort of worry. It's also like the fact that like I think a very interesting development with it is the play that it has on hormones. And I can't really speak too much about this because, well, obviously I'm not a woman, but I would like to see about maybe getting my girlfriend on the podcast, and so she could speak about that experience that she had with being on birth control, because it definitely over the long run, like it has other effects, like I mean, especially if you're taking it from a younger age, I would not be surprised if the overall hormonal effect and like your body readjusting to like not having that natural like secretion of those hormones and how your body reacts, that would have like long-term effects. I'm sure there's like some studies out there that comment on this sort of material, but it's definitely something that needs to be considered and talked about. If there's anybody in the comments that would like to sort of share their sorts of experiences with that, like being on birth control and sort of like what happened with them after like coming off from it, would love to sort of hear your experience, and I think that would be like a very interesting topic for us to engage in. Yeah, so like in that respect, we've only had like maybe about 60 years of this like social experiment where like we've had this hard turn into just being able to engage in like casual sex, and I really don't think that it's doing us any favors. I think the novelty aspect of it is very much waning thin, and there's not really much more that I could say about it in that sense. I'm sure that in the future I would like to be able to have another guest on here so we could talk about these matters further and sort of bounce off one another. But I guess you could say like after my mid-20s and having gone through these sorts of events, that it very much brought me to this place where it certainly changed my viewpoints, and I started listening more to the sorts of wisdom that people like Jordan Peterson were discussing in terms of like what it means to have like an endearing partnership with somebody, and sort of the negative effects that can also come from engaging in such behavior. So I think that largely concludes what I would like to go through today. And I'm also wanting to point out too that later this week I'm going to look to release a second episode, because last week I missed the last episode and I apologize for that. Life's been busy being a student and just juggling everything around work and family, trying to make time for everything. I'm sure you can relate. So I'd like to thank all of you for listening in on the podcast. If you would consider sharing, commenting, and subscribing, and if you're listening on Spotify, please consider following the channel if you like the sort of content that I'm engaging in. And I hope to see you all later this week or the following week. Thanks for your time. Have a good day. Bye.